need additional information, submit your request in writing, and I will discuss it with the attorneys. During the trial, you are not to engage in any conduct that impairs or interferes with your ability to hear and understand the court proceedings. Do not form final opinions about any fact or about the outcome of the case until you have heard and considered all of the evidence, the closing arguments, and the rest of the instructions I will give you on the law. Keep an open mind during the trial. Form your final opinions only after you've had an opportunity to discuss the case with each other in the jury room at the end of the trial. Please advise me in writing immediately if you believe that any juror has violated any provision of this admonition. Before each recess, I will not repeat the entire admonition I've just given you, thankfully. I will probably refer to it by saying, please remember the admonition, or something like that. However, even if I forget to make any reference to it, remember that the admonition still applies at all times during the trial. Exclusion of witnesses. The rule of exclusion of witnesses is in effect and will be observed by all witnesses until the trial is over and a result is announced. This means that all witnesses will remain outside the courtroom during the entire trial except when one is called to the witness stand. They will wait in the areas directed by the bailiff unless other arrangements have been made with the attorney who has called them. The rule also forbids witnesses from telling anyone but the lawyers what they will testify about or what they have testified to. If witnesses do talk to the lawyers about their testimony, other witnesses and jurors should avoid being present or overhearing. The lawyers are directed to inform all their witnesses of these rules and to remind them of their obligations from time to time as may be necessary. The parties and their lawyers should keep a careful lookout to prevent any potential witness from remaining in the courtroom if they accidentally enter. Questions by jurors. If at any time during the trial you have difficulty hearing or seeing something that you should be hearing or seeing, or if you get into personal distress for any reason, raise your hand and let me know. If you have any questions about parking, restaurants, or other matters relating to jury service, feel free to ask one of the court staff. But remember that the admonition applies to court staff as it does to everyone else, so do not try to discuss the case with court staff. If you have a question about the case for a witness or for me, write it down, but do not sign it. Hand the question to the bailiff. If your question is for a witness who is about to leave the witness stand, please signal the bailiff or me before the witness leaves the stand. The lawyers and I will discuss the question. The rules of evidence or other rules of law may prevent some questions from being asked. If the rules permit the question and the answer is available, an answer will be given at the earliest opportunity. When we do not ask a question, it is no reflection on the person submitting it. You should attach no significance to the decision not to ask a question. I will apply the same legal standards to your questions as I do the questions asked by the lawyers. If a particular question is not asked, please do not guess why or what the answer might have been. Media coverage. There may or may not be news media coverage of the trial. What the news media covers is up to them. If there is media coverage, you must avoid it during the trial. If you do encounter something about this case in the news media during the trial, end your exposure to it immediately and report it to me as soon as you can. If there are cameras in the courtroom during the trial, do not be concerned about them. Court rules require that the proceedings be photographed or televised in such a way that no jury, and that should read no juror, can be recognized. Scheduling during trial. The trial is expected to last through August 28th, 2014. We will all do our best to move the case along, but delays frequently occur. These won't be anyone's fault, so do not hold them against the parties. Delays usually occur because the attorneys and I often need to resolve certain legal matters before these matters may be presented to you in court, or because I am busy with matters in other cases. The usual hours of trial will be from 10:30 to 4:30. We'll take short recesses about every mid-morning. That's not correct. We won't take a mid-morning recess. We'll go from 10:30 till noon. And mid-afternoon, we will take a recess, and occasionally stretch breaks in place. That probably won't happen either. We will recess at noon and begin again at 1:30. Unless a different starting time is announced prior to recessing for the evening, you may assume a starting time of 10:30 for the next day. At the beginning of the day, please assemble in the jury room for this division. Please do not come back into the courtroom until you are called by the bailiff. Order of trial. Guilty, not guilty phase. Criminal trials generally proceed in the following order. First, the prosecuting attorney will make an opening statement giving a preview of the case. The defendant's attorney may make an opening statement outlining the defense case immediately after the prosecutor's statement, or it may be postponed until after the state's case has been presented. What is said in opening statements is not evidence, nor is it an argument. The purpose of an opening statement is to help you prepare for anticipated evidence. Second, the state will present its evidence. After the state finishes the presentation of its evidence, the defendant may present evidence. The defendant is under no obligation to present any evidence. However, if the defendant does produce evidence, the state may present additional or rebuttal evidence. With each witness, there is a direct examination, a cross-examination by the opposing side, and finally, redirect examination. This usually ends the testimony of that witness. Third, after all the evidence is in, I will read and give you copies of the final instructions, the rules of law you must follow in reaching your verdict. Fourth, the attorneys will make closing arguments to you to tell you what they think the evidence shows and how they think you should decide the case. Just as in opening statements, what is said in closing arguments is not evidence. Fifth, you will deliberate in the jury room about the evidence and rules of law in an effort to reach the verdict. If you unanimously agree upon the verdict, it will be read in court with you and the parties present. Alternate jurors. The law provides for a jury of 12 persons in a case such as this. We have more than 12 jurors so that if a juror becomes ill or has a personal emergency, the trial can continue without that juror. At the end of the case, alternate jurors will be determined by lot in a drawing held in open court. Please do not be concerned with who may or may not be chosen as an alternate at the end of the case. Conclusion to preliminary instructions. The rules of law I have charged you with in the past few minutes are preliminary only. At the end of the case, I will read to you and give you a copy of the final instructions of law. In deciding the case, you must be guided by the final instructions. Okay. Let me have you look quickly at page 10 because I left out a word and I want to make it clear that that word is supposed to be there. At the top of page 10, number 2, where it says the law enforcement officer was in the line of duty, the word "and" should follow that, A-N-D. I read that to you, but I did not write it in the instructions, and I wanted to make sure that that was clear. So again, at the top of page 10, number 2, the law enforcement officer was in the line of duty, and number 3, the defendant caused the death of the law enforcement officer. Before we start opening statements, let me talk to you a little bit about questions from jurors, because it's a process if you have a question. If you have a question, you have separate forms in your books to write that question down. After each witness testifies, I'm going to look to the jury to see if you have any questions for that witness. And if you do, just raise your hand. Kim will come and get it. I'll talk it over with the lawyers because I need to analyze whether we can ask that question. And again, as I told you in the instructions, don't be offended if I can't ask you a question. There may be legal reasons for that. So don't raise your hand during testimony or don't speak the question. That's how we do it. Okay? All right. So we're ready now for opening statements. The state gets to go first. Mr. Martinez, on behalf of the state.
I've got something for you. Or I've got this for you. That's what Bryan Wayne Hulsey said as he stepped out of the car. And this individual here, the person with the red tie and the glasses, as he was stepping from the car and saying his words, he took out a gun and took that gun and shot Officer Anthony Holly of the Glendale Police Department in the face. Officer Anthony Holly was just there as a backup for another officer who was conducting a traffic stop. Officer Anthony Holly, who was just there doing his duty that February 19th, 2007, almost over 7 years ago, sometime around 7:30 in the morning. And this individual here, the defendant, whom with the red tie, he wasn't even the driver of the car. The car was actually being driven by a woman, an individual by the name of Giota Costas. She also was known as Nikki. Nikki was the person who was driving the car, and in the front seat with her was the defendant, this individual here. But there was also somebody else in the car. In the back seat of the car was somebody by the name of Patsy Jones. And also in the back seat was a dog by the name of Kraut. And this dog belonged to Giota Costas or Nikki. And the reason that the three of them had actually gone to Glendale was because Patsy Jones had a couple of kids who were in Glendale with her brother at the general area of 60th Avenue in Oregon. But she was staying in Mesa. And what happened with the kids is that previous day, February 18th, 2007, sometime in the mid-afternoon, her nephew came and took the kids so that her two kids could go to a birthday party in Glendale. But this nephew, rather than returning the kids back to Patsy Jones that evening, took them to her brother and his house or apartment, which is roughly in the area of 60th Avenue in Oregon. And so that evening, Patsy had a decision to make. She needed to go get her kids, or she could leave them till the morning. She wanted to get the kids that evening, but she didn't have the car. To be honest, or to be upfront about it, Patsy Jones didn't have much. Not only did she not have a car, she really didn't have a place to stay. She was actually staying with her ex-husband, an individual by the name of William Jones. And he also goes by another name, or a nickname, of Too Tall. Patsy Jones was still married to Too Tall, or Mr. Jones, but they were separated. She had been told that she had cancer and that she was terminally ill and was going to die. So she didn't have a place to stay, and she was under treatment. In fact, her head didn't have any hair on it. And she was staying at this apartment, Too Tall's apartment, along with Too Tall and her two kids. One of the kids was hers and Too Tall's together. Well, she was staying at this apartment and had a decision to make. Had to go get her kids because her brother didn't want them there in the morning because he had to go to work. Even though the next day was President's Day, which was February 19th of 2007, even though it was President's Day, her brother was going to go to work. So initially, Patsy went to a neighbor that lived in a house, not in the apartment. She went to this neighbor and she asked him, "Do you mind taking me out to Glendale so I can pick up my kids?" Well, it was a little bit far for the neighbor, and the neighbor said, "No, I can't do it." And this neighbor's name was John. Well, Patsy didn't really have anybody to turn to, and at that point didn't know how she was going to get the kids. At some point, Nikki or Giota Costas showed up. And the reason that Nikki or Giota Costas would show up at the apartment is that Nikki also had a previous relationship with Too Tall, which is Patsy's husband that she was living with. And they had a child in common that everybody called John John. So you have John down the road, and then you have John John the son. And John John had just moved out from the apartment that was now being occupied by Patsy, two kids, and Mr. Jones. And in the move, when John John left, he had taken certain things. One of the things he had taken was Patsy Jones's driver's license and her birth certificate. And that evening of February 18th, 2007, Nikki came over for a number of reasons. She came over to return Patsy Jones's driver's license and her birth certificate, as well as to pack up the remaining articles that were there that were left behind by John John after he had moved. And John John was her son with Too Tall. So she gets there, and one of the first things that Patsy Jones asked is, "I need a ride to Glendale. I need a ride to Glendale to the area of 60th Avenue in Oregon because I need to pick up my kids." Well, Nikki was driving a Kia that didn't have a license plate. It did have a temporary registration, and it had a cracked windshield. It was Kia. And so Nikki said, "Sure, but I can't do it right now." She just couldn't do it at that point. And so but Nikki had another agenda. She had other things to do. And this agenda was an agenda with another individual, somebody else, which required her to go somewhere. And she asked Patsy, "Well, do you know somebody who has a car?" Even though Nikki already had the Kia. "I need to go find someone. I need to go look for someone." Patsy went down the road to talk to John, the person who would not take her to Glendale, asked for a favor to go around the Mesa area because they were in Mesa. And this individual said, well, it's close, Mesa, and his name is John. I will take you. And he drove a Jeep. They get into the car, and as they're driving along, they come to a stoplight. And Nikki has been talking to somebody on the phone, very, very animated in the conversation. They come to a stoplight, and Nikki gets out of the car. Well, John, the driver, and Betsy Jones don't know what to do, and so they turn around and they come back to the apartment without Nikki. When Betsy Jones is back, much to her surprise, there's Nikki. She's already come back. She beat her back to the apartment. But Nikki is not alone. She's with an individual, another individual with her, that's with her. And this individual is Brad. And this Brad is an individual that maybe she wanted to go find, but she left without him, came back, and now she's with Brad. Brad sits in this courtroom today. Person with glasses, red tie. That's Brad. That's how he was introduced to Patsy. So they sit around and they go inside the apartment that Patsy is staying at, along with two. And it's in the evening now, it's dark. Patsy wasn't keeping track, doesn't know times, but it was dark. And they're sitting there and they're talking. Well, as they continue talking, at some point, Brad, who is carrying what can only be called a man purse, thing that wraps around your neck, small circular kind of purse that's about maybe 10 inches by 6 inches, something like that. He's carrying that around in the apartment. He keeps looking out the window. He's kind of sweating. He just keeps looking around. But at some point, he takes out a pipe, a glass pipe. And he takes out this glass pipe, and he takes out a substance, speed, as Patsy Jones would call it, methamphetamine. He puts the speed in the pipe, lights it up, and he takes a drag out of it, smokes it, begins to smoke it. He then gives the pipe over to Gianna Costas. He gives the pipe over to Gianna Costas.
Do we have an issue? Yes.
Need another pen.
You need another pen? We'll get you another pen. Do we have one?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Go ahead.
Brad, the defendant, gives the pipe over to Nikki, Gianna Costas, who puts the flame underneath it and also begins to smoke. At the time that he does that, Brad turns to Patsy and says, "You want to get high?" or words to that effect. He wants them. And Patsy says, "Sure, I'll go ahead." And she also takes a smoke out of it. And she does smoke once out of this pipe, just like the others. At that point, Nikki, or sometime thereafter, shortly thereafter, Nikki asks Patsy whether or not she and Brad can take a shower. The thing is that right about this time, Nikki starts calling the defendant Bryan. And Patsy notices that first it's Brad, then it's Bryan, and she sort of asks the defendant about him. She says, "Well, it's really Bryan, but it's Brad." Just says that. Well, Brad, or Bryan, defendant, however you want to call him, along with Nikki, or also known as Yoda, they go into the bathroom to take a shower. And this is a long shower. It takes approximately an hour. The two of them are inside that shower for approximately an hour. And then showered, come out, and still, though, there hasn't been any packing that has taken place. And so, at some point, they begin to pack some of the items that belong to John so that Yoda can take them with her in the Kia. They begin to pack these, and nothing gets into the Kia. At some point, they do take them in and they take them out, but nothing is actually that belongs to John is actually put in the Kia. But Brad, the defendant, and Nikki decide to leave. And again, this is at night. And again, Patsy Jones will not be able to tell you that it was this time or that time. She can give you the sequence, but she cannot give you the exact time. At that point, Brad takes off in the Kia with Nikki, and Nikki is driving. Gianna Costas is driving. They're gone for a certain period of time, some time. Then they come back. When they come back, Jada Costas has now brought something with her. She's brought the dog Kraut with her. It's just a Rottweiler that she brought back with her, brings it up into the apartment, and they begin to talk again. By now, it's getting close to morning, and Patsy is starting to get a little worried because she has to get to her kids before the morning. And it is, now it's February 19th, and even though the sun comes up a little bit late, she's noticing that it's starting to get pretty early now. And she needs to get over to pick up her kids in Glendale in the general area of 60th Avenue in Oregon. Well, as she tells him about it, Nikki says, yes, this will get done. This will get done. So they're sitting there, and it's getting close to 6 o'clock. And 6 o'clock can be benchmarked because Too works in cabinetry somewhere out in Mesa. And he leaves the house around 6 o'clock in the morning. And so around 6 o'clock in the morning, Too goes to work. So now the people that are left in the apartment are Patsy Jones, Brad, the individual in court today, Bryan, however he wants to be called, and then Nikki, and also the dog. Before they take off, Brad holds out the pipe again and says, anybody want to take another hit, or words to that effect? And the pipe is lit, and the three of them each begin to use speed or methamphetamine again before they go on this drive with Nikki driving. And as I told you, it is now past 6 o'clock in the morning, and they need to get over to Patsy Jones's brother's house out in Glendale, which is quite a ways, and he needs to get to work that morning. And so they get into the Kia, the one without the license plate, the one with a temporary registration in the back part of the car, and a cracked windshield, and they begin driving, or taking the drive, out to Glendale. And as they're driving along, they take I-17 or the freeway, and Costas gets off on Camelback and begins driving westbound on Camelback. Right about the time that she begins driving there, or a little bit before, around 6 o'clock, because we don't know exactly when she took off. Driving may have been shortly after Too left. It was sometime after 6 o'clock. Right about that time, Officer David Goidia of the Glendale Police Department starting his day. He starts at 6 o'clock in the morning, at the same time as Too, different profession. And one of the first things that he does, it's not a day that's out of the ordinary, it's just his job, he's just going on duty, is that he goes to a briefing. And at this briefing, they discuss things to look out for, things that they need to be careful or about, or just general information. That briefing, as they call it, lasts maybe 15, 20, 25 minutes. Officer Goya gets out, gets into his marked Glendale Police Department officer. He is dressed as a Glendale police officer. There's no mistaking that. He's got the shield, he's got the emblem, he's got the car that has the overhead lights on it, and on the side of the car is the emblem that indicates that this is a Glendale Police Department officer that's driving this car. Takes that car, and he goes over to the area where they get their gasoline, and he fills it up with gasoline in anticipation of the day. So by now, this time it's around 6:30, maybe 6:45 in the morning. And he decides to head out to the general area of 57th Avenue and Camelback. And the reason that he's going there is that that area is known for perhaps having some activity that the police like to take a look at. And he's also there as a deterrent, he'll tell you, because if people see a police officer, less criminal conduct is less likely to occur. And of course, he's there for enforcement purposes. And he's sitting there, facing southbound, looking at the traffic as it goes by that President's Day. And one of the things that he notices, sometime around 7 o'clock in the morning, as he's sitting there in his patrol car, is he notices this Kia go by, a silver kind of Kia go by. And he notices that it's driving very fast, or it's speeding, and it catches his eye, and he decides that he's going to investigate this, that he's going to follow it, he's going to stop the car, because it's speeding, which is something that he does. That's something the police do. And so he begins to follow the car and gets behind it going westbound on Camelback Road. He's not immediately behind the car, but he starts speeding up to try to catch up to it. And as he's getting closer, he notices it doesn't have a plate. And so he begins to and by plate I mean license plate, and he begins to get closer as the car then takes a right northbound on 59th Avenue. Now he's starting to get a little bit closer. And then, a short block or so later, he notices that the car takes a left onto Oregon. And he's much closer now as the Kia takes a left onto Oregon to go westbound. He's very close. He's so close that the people inside the car now notice him. The lights are not on yet, but they notice him. And at that time, it's about 7:15 in the morning. The sun is already out, but he still has his headlights on. He doesn't have his overheads on, but it's light enough out, and it's kind of that time of the day where you can have your lights on or not. But he has his lights on. He can see without the use of the lights, and he gets behind the car. And the people inside the car, the Kia, notice him. As the car then takes a right, which would be northbound onto 60th Avenue, and that's the area they are going to drop Patsy Jones off, he pulls over to the right. Not because the officer has turned the overhead lights on, but because that's the area that they're going to drop Patsy Jones off. But as they begin to take that turn, one of the things that Bryan, whatever you want to call him, does is he takes the pipe and he takes the methamphetamine, gives it to Patsy Jones and says, "Get rid of this. Get rid of them." Patsy takes them. Doesn't know what to do with them. She's sitting in the back seat with Kraut. She didn't know what to do with them, but takes them anyway. And as she's sitting there, knowing that the police are behind them, sticks them underneath the seat. Takes the pipe, what she believes to be speed, and sticks them underneath the pipe and sits there. The car comes to a stop, and it comes to a stop on the right side of the road appropriately, and the three of them start to get out of the car because, again, this is their end destination. Patsy's now going to go over to her kids. Right about the time that they start, when they go to get out of the car, Officer David Goya, who has made a decision to stop the car, turns on the overhead lights and gets behind the Kia. At the same time, right about that time, he radios in to the dispatcher what he's doing, and he says, "I need a slow roll. A slow roll is just a backup. I need somebody, another officer, to come with me on this." It's not that he suspects anything. It's not that he thinks that anything's wrong. This is just a run-of-the-mill traffic stop, but he requests a slow roll. It's not a fast roll. And the person that he talks to, the dispatcher, then goes on the radio and asks people, officers, at this stop that's taking place at 60th Avenue in Oregon, which one of you wants to take this call and be the backup? Well, other people responded to this backup. Ned Wilkins, for example, another officer responded to this backup. Other officers are thinking that they're going to respond to it, but they're told not to. They're told not to respond to this call. And the reason that they're told not to respond to this call is because Officer Anthony Hawley was first. He's the person that answered the call. He's the individual that answered what was going to be his last call, the call of death. And he starts driving to the area of 60th Avenue in Oregon. Officer David Goya does not wait for the backup. He doesn't wait for Hawley, Officer Hawley, no. What he does is he actually gets out of the car and approaches the driver, goes up to the driver, who you now know as Costas, J.R. Costas, Nikki, and starts talking to her. And he asks the questions that all police officers ask. But one of the things he asks is for a driver's license. And then he looks at the other two. He looks at Brad. Then he looks at Patsy Jones and he says, "I need your identification." Jonah Costas does not have any identification on her. So the officer has a card, what is called a field interrogation card or a 36 card, whatever name they give it, and he writes down her name and her identifying information. But doesn't have any official ID. Patsy Jones, as you now know, she just got the license, her driver's license back. So she gets the driver's license and gives it to the officer. And Brad, the passenger, also gives a driver's license. Bradley Hulsey, that's the name on the driver's license. Gives it to the police officer. Right when this is going on, when this conversation is taking place, Officer Anthony Hawley arrives at the scene. And he parks next to Officer David Godey's car. And he goes to assume the backup position. And the backup position is he goes over to the passenger side of the car. If you remember, Officer David Godey was on the driver's side. He is on the passenger side, sort of standing there between the front and the back passenger seat. And as he's standing there, Officer Godey mentions to him to take a look at the temporary registration that's in the back there. Take a look at it sort of in a way, something that you need to take a look at. And Officer David Godey then goes to his computer to check out these individuals to find out more about them, which is what law enforcement does. So he went to his computer. And when he goes to his computer, Officer Hawley then asks Patsy Jones to roll the window down so that he could reach in and get the temporary registration that's on the back window. He's not able to get it, but he asks Patsy Jones to give it to him, and she complies. Gives him the registration. He looks at it and realizes by the comments that he makes that this isn't valid. There's something wrong with it. About this time, Brad, the individual that's in the front passenger seat, starts to get perhaps a little agitated and says something to the effect of, all of this for a cracked windshield? Sir Hawley says, don't know. Don't know what we're going to do. We don't know what's going on. I'm just back. I'm just here. And so, by that point in time, this has given Officer Godey plenty of time to do the running of these people. And he comes back, and as he's walking back, he looks at Officer Hawley. And he raises his hands like this, with his two fingers up. Today, that when they search the car, one of the things that they're going to find in the back seat is a duffel bag belonging to the individual here. And so Officer David Godey, goes up to the front passenger side window. And Officer Anthony Hawley is behind him. And so David Godey begins to talk to him. And previous to that, the defendant has manifested that he's really pretty upset. He starts cursing. Why is this being hacked? Words to that effect. It's just a cracked windshield. And he's asked about his ID, if he's either Brad or Bryan. And he says something to the effect, you have my fucking ID. Why are you asking me? You know who I am. Well, the officer says, I may want to search you. He says, no. Well, you're going to need me. And he's told by Officer David Godey that he's got to get out of the car. The defendant asks whether or not he can take his man purse with him or if he needs to leave it behind. Officer David Godey at first says, leave it behind, take it, do whatever you want with it. You just need to get out of the car. And at this time, if this is the passenger side, and this is where the defendant is seated, Anthony Hawley is just behind him, right there. Back up, that's all he is. The person in charge is David Godey. As the defendant starts to get out of the car with the man purse, Officer David Godey touches him, goes to touch his arm. And as he goes to touch his arm, and he's standing right here, now he's happy. As he goes to touch his arm, the defendant goes to the area right here in his waist. And he goes to the area there for a purpose. He goes there because he has a .357 revolver. A revolver is one that has the bullets in the cylinder and that turn whenever there's a shot. Not to be confused with semi-automatic. It has the magazine and the bullets cycle through and the casings pop out. The difference for our purposes here is that the semi-automatic, it ejects the casings, whereas the revolver, the casings stay inside. He has a .357 large gun, and he whirls and says, "I've got something for you," or "I've got this for you." As he begins to whirl around, he holds it up and starts to point it at Sir David Goydian. It's all in one motion. It's all very quick. And David Goydian is standing here. This is where the defendant is standing. And behind him, maybe not being able to see everything, is Anthony Holland. At that point, David Goydian begins to run. David Goydian begins to run. Patsy Jones is watching this. She's at the back seat. And she's able to see the defendant's face, how he's got his jaw clenched. He even looks at her as he's holding the gun sideways, and he's walking towards police officers with the gun. Doesn't take a lot of steps, just begins a movement in that direction. And she sees the gun as the bullet rings out. And she can hear the bullet because the window is open. Hears it. By that time, David Goydian on gun, the only person back there is Anthony Holland. The defendant then, at that point, Patsy Jones turns down and doesn't look up, but does hear a second shot. It's the same gun that's shooting. She'll tell you, it's the same gun that's shooting. And then she looks up again to the back window to the side and sees the defendant with the gun, and now he's sighting David Goydian as he's running away. And she's looking at him. Doesn't know what has happened outside. She just knows the two shots are rung out. And then she sees as the defendant begins to run in this direction, where you would be, to a grassy area there next to some apartments. Begins to run in that direction. And as he runs, David Goydian being over there, he's got the gun like this and fires another shot. Then she begins to hear the return fire of David Goydian, who has gone over to the area of 60th and 60th Avenue, the intersection of Oregon, approximately maybe 50 yards, maybe less than that, maybe 40 yards. And he begins to fire at the defendant, and he's able to hit him in the right knee. And the defendant goes down. And he still has the man first with him. He's got white glasses, he's got a cell phone, and he's got the gun, the .357. And at some point, the defendant disappears around the building. He continues on, running, walking. Don't know exactly how he did it. David Goydian, at that time, is still fearful that he's going to be shot because he's got this individual out there with the gun. And rather than being out here in the open, because that's where he went and that's where he started shooting, he's afraid he's going to get hit. He runs back to an area across the street. So he would be on the west side. The Kia is on the east side. He goes to the west side to take cover behind a white car that's directly opposite. If this is the Kia, the white car's right here, it's behind him. So that he can see if anybody's coming so he can take a shot. Looking around. Well, Patsy Jones is not going to stay in the car seeing all of this. She gets out of the car and says, "Don't shoot." She's saying, "Don't shoot," to David Bryan. And she's the person who actually gets to Officer Anthony Holly first. And she goes up to him, and David Bryan is across the street, taking cover behind a white car. She goes up to him and notices, and she's there almost immediately after he's been shot. He's now at the back of the Kia, clearly started to go when he saw the defendant with the gun. And he has fallen in the back of the Kia with his head in the roadway and part of his body behind the rear bumper. And he's there, and as she looks at him, it appears to her that he's hunching up, trying to get up. See that? Once, maybe twice. She gets closer and looks at him, and by now it's light, so she can see. And she looks and she sees as he turns his head towards her and looks at her. But he doesn't say a word, doesn't say anything. and he's spitting up blood and making gurgling sounds, but isn't saying anything. She also notices as he spits out his teeth. And yes, it's only a bridge. It is a bridge that he spits out. But it's his teeth that he has. And we know that other teeth were also loosened in the shot, because the shot didn't actually go into the brain. It actually went through his face on the right side, and then it came out on the left side. And the concussive effect just caused huge damage. There's no way that he was going to be sane. And so she then, as he looks up at her, he then goes face down into the pavement and ready for death. Because this type of injury is not one you can recover from. It'll take 4 to 5 minutes to die if you don't get medical intervention. But you're not going to recover either way. Well, police officers then get to the body, or Officer Anthony Hawley, shortly thereafter. But before they get there, David Cody is screaming at him after he has already gone down and his face is down. Hawley, come to me. I've got you covered. Come to me. Officer Hawley is not going anywhere. Well, David Cody then goes over and drags him by a bulletproof vest, the one that's supposed to protect him, and drags him all the way back to where the white car is. It is there that other officers come, assist. They take Officer Anthony Hawley, stick him in the back of the patrol car, back seat, lay him down there, and they drive away onto Oregon Avenue to an area that's closer to 59 and 60th Avenue on the south side of the street. Coincidence, on the north side of the street is where the defendant is hiding. And they take him there because the paramedics, the fire department, are not going to come into a scene that is not secure, where they might suffer some injury, and that's why they have to drive him out. But paramedics are waiting. They take him to the hospital, but it's to no avail. And the reason that it's to no avail, because the defendant's aim was true. One bullet was all it took to the face of Anthony Hawley to kill him. Officer Anthony Hawley, who was just doing his job that February 19, 2007, more than 7 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and take our lunch break. So we're going to take a break until 1:30. If you'd be back at 1:25. Until then, remember that admonition that I gave you, and we will see you at 1:25. We'll see you at 1:30, but you need to assemble at 1:25. Go ahead and follow the out. Okay, please be seated, everyone. Okay, we are outside the presence of the jury. We'll start with the defense opening statement at 1:30. Anything the state needs to put on the record?
No, thank you.
Anything from the defense?
No, sir.
Be prepared after the opening statement. We'll finish for the day. As I said, we're not going to have any witness testimony today, and then we'll talk about the motions that are outstanding at that time. All right? See everybody at 1:30.